Hi, my name is Adam Powley, and I'm the American history teacher here at Early College High School. Um, I've been asked to speak a little bit about AVID literacy in the social studies classroom. Now, I teach American history, but these are some pretty general concepts throughout history and the social studies classrooms. When we talk about literacy in a social studies classroom, what I'm going to focus on is reading. Now, we're also going to do a lot of writing, a lot of investigation. I use a lot of collaboration, and there's a lot of organization in the terms of graphic organizers and creating different products. But for today, I want to focus just on reading and some of the techniques that we use in the history classroom. Now, literacy is trying to gain meaning, understanding, and knowledge, in this case from print and other media resources. And through the Wicker strategies, we want students to be able to apply prior knowledge, make connections between these sources, make predictions as to what they think is going to happen in the future, and ask questions. These are all things that historians do. We try to find sources, we try to find connections between those sources, we predict what we'll find in other sources, and then we ask questions that lead to more paths for us to find more information. One important distinction that we make in the social studies, or at least in history classes, is between a primary source and a secondary source. Primary sources are things that were created during the time period that we're studying and tell us about that time period. The way I like to think of this is that primary sources are of history. If we're talking about the American Revolution, George Washington's journals would be a great example of a primary source. So wouldn't letters between two soldiers on the battlefield. Musket balls would be a great example of a primary source artifact. Things of the period that tell us about the past. Secondary sources, on the other hand, are created after the fact. Usually, and we talk about secondary sources in our modern context, we're talking about modern pieces of scholarship. They use primary sources to create an argument. These are things about history. Oftentimes, secondary sources are created using primary sources as evidence. What we do in a social studies classroom is try to source a primary source. So we've done our research, we're asking a question about the past, we've gone out and we've found all of these different items that might help us understand the past, but we need to analyze them. We need to understand the biases, we need to understand how we can use them, and we also need to be able to have something to compare them to. And one trick that historians have is to look at what we use in AVID is a term called ACAPS. We try to determine the author, the context, the audience, and the purpose before we summarize the document. And a lot of this information can be garnered without even reading the source. If you're trying to help your student in a social studies class, oftentimes just trying to figure out who has written a document and why that document was written is important. And students often understand this as we start talking about this pretty implicitly. You can talk one way around your parents, and you can talk one way around your friends, but you're not going to talk to your parents the way you talk to your friends. And you're not going to talk to your friends the way you talk to your parents, because the context is different, the audience is different, and the reason that you're talking to them is different. Students understand this on a personal level, but oftentimes when students and even some adults, they look at a source from the past, they assume that it's being honest. They assume that it's how everybody felt about a topic. And that's just not the case. So let's take an example. Here is an example about the Reconstruction. Now, Reconstruction is a time period after the American Civil War from 1865 to about 1877. This source is talking about Reconstruction, and we know who the author is. The author is Henry Adams. Henry Adams was a former slave. He's a man. He seems to be some sort of a farm worker. So if you were to read through this document, he is talking about his experience in a small southern town following the events of the Civil War. For context, we can think of context in a couple of different ways. We can think about Henry Adams in the context of his statement. What is he saying? Well, he's saying he's talking about September of 1865. That would put it at the beginning of Reconstruction, before the federal government has decided to step in and protect the freedmen, the newly emancipated Black population in the South. However, a historian would look at that and they're going to look at the bottom of this screen and they're going to see that Henry Adams was making his statement in 1880. This is 15 years after this event. They're also going to see that he's making this statement to a very particular audience. He's talking to the United States Senate. Now, this changes the meaning of the document because we have to understand why he is speaking to the US Senate. So we know who the author is, and we know more than just this person's name, and it's important to know more than just their name. It's relevant that this person is a former slave. It's relevant also that his audience is the US Senate. He's speaking in a formal setting. He's probably speaking in some sort of an investigation. It's relevant that he's speaking in 1880 because the context of 1880 is that Reconstruction is over. The federal government has pulled the soldiers out of the southern states and has largely left the Black population at the mercy of a southern state government system where each state is trying to implement some version of a white supremacist Jim Crow system at that time. So he's speaking to the United States Senate, who has just abandoned people like him in that territory. The purpose is he's giving some sort of a testimony to what happened during the early part of the Civil War before the federal government decided to protect the Black population there. So all of that information is going to play into questions of bias. Why is he doing this? What is the purpose in this? How is his point of view going to be different from somebody else's point of view? So we have sourced the information, we've analyzed the information, and now what we would do is try to find other examples from that time period to help us answer whatever question it is that we have. In this case, we'd be asking how free were African Americans during the Reconstruction era. A visual example would look something like this. Now this is a picture from probably around 1880, I'm sorry, from probably around 1900. This is a picture by a guy named Jacob Riis. Jacob Riis was creating a visual book, kind of a coffee table book in the Progressive era. And he was trying to make some money off of this. He himself is what we'd call a muckraker. He's a journalist who's trying to highlight some of the different problems of that era. He is trying to make some money off of this. He's also trying to raise awareness. So that's the purpose. The context of this, he's talking about problems of the inner city, particularly tenements. Tenements were full of newly arrived immigrants who tended to be poor. So he's trying to show their problems. This is part of the Progressive era. So he was trying to get the government to change elements of the urban situation. So he's trying to raise awareness. Specific context is that he paid this man to sit here 10 cents. So that might change the meaning of the picture a little bit. He also refers to the man in as a derogatory slur when he's describing the picture later. So we know he doesn't really approve of this guy. So all of that is going to be part of that context. When we look at the audience is middle-class white progressives that are going to potentially buy his book. So he's trying to get people to buy that book while also raising awareness. All of that changes the meaning of the picture because we need to look at what his potential biases are so that we can account for them when we look at the pictures. So we're gaining information about literacy by looking even at images. So that's how we would source a primary source. Secondary sources are also interesting to take a look at that too, because what we need to do is what we call author validity. Secondary sources are only as good as the people that write them. And there are a wide variety of people that write, and they all have different biases and backgrounds. And I've used that word a lot, bias. In history, we don't think of bias necessarily as a negative thing because we all have a bias. When we say bias, what we mean is, what is the author's point of view? What is their perspective? What are the things that are going to influence the writing that they have? And this is incredibly important with secondary sources. If you think of primary sources as individual Legos, um, my box of Legos and your box of Legos might be the same, but we're going to build different structures out of them. Secondary sources are the same way. We get a pile of primary sources, and then we're going to try to build an argument out of those. And based on my vision and my creativity and my past experiences, I might build something that's very different than what you build. Historians are the same way. They're going to take their influence and their backgrounds and their past experience, and they're going to apply them to the sources in a certain way, which is why history is this open debate, and it's always being discussed, and it's always changing. It's always in a process of revision based on the evidence that we have and the people that are asking those questions. Secondary source validity, where we are going to check the author of the source. So we want to find out who the author is, and we want to see what the author's background is, what level of expertise they might have they written any other books or articles, all of that to determine the potential biases and how we can account for them and how we can predict what they're going to write in the article before we even get to the article. For example, there is a database called the Gilder-Lehrman database, and this is an interesting article from there that is an example I want to use. So we can see this article is called Race in the American Constitution, A Struggle Towards National Ideas, and it's written by James Oliver Horton. Now, one thing that we can do is simply Google the author's name, and the first thing that comes up with James Oliver Horton, and we would obviously use additional sources for this, but just as a quick example, this is from the Columbia College of Arts and Sciences, so it's a pretty reputable organization. And James Oliver Horton worked for the Columbia College. So this is he must be a historian. He occupied the Benjamin Banneker seat of American Studies in History. So he's an American historian at an elite college. So that's interesting. That gives him a little bit of validity there. We can see what else he's done. Here's some of his publications. He wrote some books. Books down here. He's had a few exhibits that he's curated, so that's pretty impressive. He won. We can look. He died in 2017. So we can see his obituary here. He won a couple of awards. So it looks like he's got a pretty valid understanding of the past based on his books. And then when we look at the title of the books and the articles he's written, he seems to have a specialty in African-American history. So it seems like he would be a good person to read an article called Race in the American Constitution. Now, we can do that in other areas as well. We can look at, say, a website, and we can try to figure out who the author of the website is. If we can't figure out who the author of the website is, it's not very valid because anybody with an internet connection can create a website. So we often ask students to find the author, research the author before they even look at the source. That way they can get a better understanding of who that person is and what their biases are. So the last thing I'm going to wrap up with here is reading a secondary source. So an article about history, a modern piece of scholarship. We want to look for the arguments. What is the main idea of the article? Usually it's in the first paragraph or two. The historians are trained to write so that, yes, they're writing a narrative history, right? Usually it's going to be a narrative if it's out to the general public, but a narrative history is going to try to tell a story, but they're often going to build their argument about why they're writing that story in the first few paragraphs. We want to look for the evidence. What sources are they using? What is the primary sources? What are the other historical arguments that they're using to build their argument? One thing that often is overlooked is what are the authors leaving out? What is some of the evidence that maybe you know of or you've seen in other articles or you've learned about elsewhere? What is it that's being left out? Why is it being left out? Is it left out because there's not really a lot of great evidence for it? We can see that a lot in history, that sometimes people assume things and then new evidence is brought in that disrupts that assumption. For example, during Reconstruction back in the 40s, they assumed that the African Americans elected into Congress, into the South Carolina legislature, didn't have any educational skill set, but Then as time went on in the 1980s, it was researched and found that they were quite educated. So there weren't this ignorant group that was in charge of the state. Or are they leaving it out unintentionally? Is there just so much information about that topic that there are certain things that are being left out that maybe they don't influence the argument? So we have to consider the argument in information that's being left out and why it could potentially be left out. And all of that is going to do is help us to understand the bias that we need to account for. So reading in history is a lot about trying to understand who's writing, why they're writing, just as much as about what they're actually putting into that article. Thank you for listening to my brief talk about AVID literacy. I hope that it was helpful. I'm always willing to talk more about this. If you have any questions, I'd be certainly happy to chat more. You can find my email on our website, or it's apowley001@horrycountyschools.net, and I'd be glad to chat. So thank you very much. Have a wonderful night.